Religwo, my name is David Peterson and this is The Art of Language Invention. Episode 5, Musical Conlangs. Viewer John Michael Swift sent me an email saying that he was going to be creating a musical conlang for a project that he's working on, which that is, just really cool. But he also asked me if there's anything you needed to know about tonal languages in order to actually produce a musical conlang. The short answer to that is no. Relative tone languages are entirely different phenomena from, music. They're not actually musical. Don't worry, I'll do videos on tone later. But of course, there are a number of things that you should consider if you're making a musical conlang. First and foremost, it's very important to know that, yes, you absolutely can make a musical conlang. In fact, it's been done. The most famous musical conlang ever probably is Sol Re Sol. If you haven't heard of it, it was created by François Soudre in France in 1827, I want to say, somewhere in the early 19th century. And what he did was he used the seven major notes of the Western scale, which in French, if you call them by name, are Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Si. And then, of course, the last one would be Do, but Do is, of course, the same note. It's just one octave up. So he used those 7 major notes and produced an entire language from them. Basically, he treated each note like a phoneme, and with the ability to lengthen one of them, what he called accenting one of them, so producing a total of 14 possible phonemes, each of which was a tone that was either short or long. And then he arranged these into words that were as long as 5 phonemes, or tonemes long, and as short as 2. Then with this, he basically put together a language. One cool thing that Soudre understood about language is that it doesn't need to come in a fixed form. So with Sol Re Sol, you could actually sing it or, play it on the trumpet, since they were actual the tones, and they were just, tones of the scale, and they could be short or long. But you could also write it using Roman characters, using the actual names of the tones, that is the Do, Re, Mi, Fa, So part. Or you could write it on a sheet of music, because of course they are just tones. He associated a unique color to each tone, so you could actually do it with colors only. He also associated a unique glyph with each tone, so that you could write it in kind of its own orthography. And you could do any of those things to actually speak or use Sol Re Sol. This principle is going to be very important when it comes to understanding how you're going to go about creating a musical conlang, or really any conlang, if you think about it. We usually do spoken conlangs, but you don't necessarily have to, and this principle is going to be important. The principle I'm talking about is the association between arbitrary tokens and meaning. You can use literally anything to create a language. We use sounds a lot, but, you can use signs, as happens with sign languages, parts of the body. You can use, iPhones. What else have I got around here? Receipts. Like literally anything. You just find them and say, all right, I'm going to make a language using these things. Then the question you have to ask yourself is divided into 4 parts, into basically how you take these tokens and turn them into a language. The first question is, what are your tokens? So basically define them. Are they going to be sounds? Are they going to be bricks? Are they going to be works of art? It can be whatever. Next question is, based on what your tokens are, how many of them are there logically? So if you decide that you want to create a language using just your fingers, then, your tokens are these 10 right here. Like, you have 10 maximum tokens. You might decide that you can produce slightly different number of phonemes if, say, you have this is 1 and then this is 2. So, you can bend the fingers and maybe put them up in different combinations. But basically, you've got these 10 guys to work with. If you're using sounds, then there are literally hundreds of tokens. And it's not a question of using all of them for a language. It's a question of which ones do you want to use for your language. The next question is, once you've got your tokens, are there enough to produce a language? Luckily, If your number of tokens is 2 or greater, the answer is yes. That is, we have binary, and it does work. So you need at least 2 tokens to produce a language, even though that's really on the small end. And you think, well, why aren't all languages just using 2 tokens, whether it be 2 sounds or 2 signs or whatever? That brings us to the last part of the question. Once you have your tokens, you know what they are, and you know how many of them are, and you know how many you're going to use, is the resultant language that you can produce with those tokens easily usable and understandable by human beings? This is where binary breaks down. Naturally, computers can use it just fine, but human beings, if you actually tried to produce a language that just had 2 sounds, kind of like in that Star Trek episode where you have those aliens talking to one another using just the 2 sounds, no, we can't do it. I mean, literally, we probably could if it was written down on paper and we had all the time in the world. You could probably do binary, but just speaking and having normal conversations, nah, it just doesn't make sense. Plus, we have so many sounds, it doesn't make sense not to use a whole bunch of them. So moving on to our main topic of a musical conlang, and then bringing back the tone languages, bringing the tone languages back into it. The reason that tone languages aren't musical is that their tones are relative. That is, what matters is that syllable A is higher or lower than syllable B. It doesn't matter if syllable A is G as opposed to G sharp, or I think that's F, I can't remember. Anyway, or if the previous tone is E or B or whatever, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Just whether it's higher or lower, whether the contour basically follows this pattern, that's what matters for a tone language. If you're doing a musical language like Sol, where it does matter what each note is, that's when tonality becomes important, and you have to start reconsidering how you're going to be doing it, and if the result is going to be human usable. Bringing in my good friend, Mr. Ukulele. Ta-da! Let's think about a language like Sol. All right, if you have all of the notes and they're very regular and they're very specific, I want you to think about, is it easy to distinguish 2 words like this? That's 1. That's 2. Now think about doing that on a consistent basis so that you also have words like or, anything that you can imagine. Is that going to be really easy for people to distinguish? If not, then, the possibility for confusion is rife and the language is going to become really difficult to use. To give you more of a concrete example of what I mean, compare a spoken language to this musical language and compare syllables that are minimally different. Think about a single tone is basically a single syllable in a spoken language. So imagine a language where these 4 words are distinguished. Each of them has totally different meanings. Ba-ba, 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 ba-pa. Now, obviously that's not the easiest thing to distinguish, but I bet we can do it. Would it be easier to distinguish that than to distinguish 4 words like this? In order to not have a bunch of small words that are kind of difficult to distinguish, you could just make longer words that are all very, very different. But you have to consider how it would be to actually hear that and decipher it. So for example, you could have a word that was something like, but, after a number of notes, you just start to forget, and it's I don't know. Maybe if you were a really well-trained musician and had a very good memory, you could do it. But consider that would just be 1 word in a sentence that might have anywhere from 7 to 10 to 12 words. I don't know. Now, something else you could do is add new octaves, and so that a note that's 1 octave up would actually be a different phoneme. I mean, you could do that, but again, it's going to increase or add to the complexity for the hearer having to decipher the message. So that, for example, would be different from 2 different words. Maybe. Something else you could do is expand your notion of what the variables can be, what the tokens can be. So for example, if you're working with a stringed instrument, note that this won't work for something like a trumpet or an alto sax unless you have multiple players. You could use chords. So, for example, rather than having to distinguish two notes, people would have to be able to tell the difference between something like C and G. That could work, but it will also radically reduce the number of tokens you have, and also probably increase the time that it takes to play them and the complexity for whoever's going to produce the music. But I mean, unless you're going to admit for, like, you know, just really random stuff like, oh, actually, that's a very nice chord. Okay, but here, I can find an awful one. Just one second. Something like, yeah, like that. Oh, listen to how awful that is. That would, you know, unless you were going to allow that to be one of your phonemes, you know, you probably are not going to be working with as large a set of tokens as you could be otherwise. Another idea I had, and this could be really cool if you had a band, is that you could, in effect, assign different vocabulary sets to different instruments. So you're using the same melody patterns, and, you know, using only the recognizable ones or easy ones or short ones, but in order to increase your number of tokens, you just take those same melodies and assign them to different instruments, so that something like, I don't know, like something like that would mean one thing if played on the guitar, a different thing if it was played on a trumpet, a different thing if it was played on a piano, and so on and so forth. Increasing, you know, adding however many number of instruments you think that your audience can easily distinguish. Then there probably wouldn't be as many things to remember. In fact, you could actually treat this kind of like a noun class system, where, you know, something like the thing I just played, which was this. Something like that would have a similar meaning when played on the trumpet versus being played on the guitar. Maybe, you know, it would be in the same ballpark, but it would just come from two different classes of words. Maybe if guitars just did plants, and then trumpets just did animals, you would have these two words that, I don't know, what's a plant and animal that makes sense? I don't know, like a frog and a frog tulip. I'm going to say that a frog tulip is a thing. I don't think it is a thing, but if it were a thing, that could be something you could do. One strong recommendation I have is, if you're doing a musical conlang, I think you should simplify your vocabulary. Don't try to create the full vocabulary of a natural language or another conlang, a spoken conlang. I think it will ultimately get too difficult, either for the performer or for the listener, or for both. Perhaps you've heard of things like, you know, whistle registers or drum registers from some of the natural languages on Earth, like Piraha and the Kele languages. Those claims are usually exaggerated, you know, especially once they get to the mainstream media and say, oh, there's this language where you can whistle the entire language, and it's even more complex than the spoken version. All just BS. No. If you compare the spoken version of that language to the whistled version of the same language, which one do you think is going to be more complex? Definitely not the whistled version. Even so, you can get a fair ways just using some sort of tonality to convey meaning. You can even do this with English, like, for example, So that's probably where it breaks down. But, you know, you can kind of follow what I was doing beforehand, right? Yeah, for the most part. The main takeaway from this video, I think, is that a musical conlang can be done, and should be. Everybody should be doing these. We need more of these. It can't just be sol re sol, the one example we keep trotting out. Let's do better than that. It's just a question of, well, it's kind of a cost-benefit analysis. You can have a musical conlang that is 100% as complex as a spoken conlang, but it will probably be very hard to use, very hard to understand, and not very musical. You can do that, or you can do kind of a simplified musical conlang with a restricted vocabulary set. It won't be able to convey as much information as a spoken language, but It will be, hopefully, somewhat easier to use and easier to understand for the performer and the audience. And, it could actually be quite musical and would be interesting to hear. I would be interested to hear it. So anyway, conlangers, please, more musical conlangs. We need this. I think it could be really, 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 really cool. We just haven't seen a great one yet. That's it for this episode. If you have a question you'd like me to answer on the show, leave a note in the comments or send me an email at djpquery@gmail.com. If you want to see more videos like this one, feel free to subscribe. Thanks for watching.